The day I received the demolition notice, I wasn't mourning an old factory. I was mourning the truth buried inside it. To Daniel Whitmore and his executives, the building was nothing more than rusted steel, broken windows, and expensive land waiting for redevelopment. They laughed when I begged them to delay the wrecking crews for just one day. Then I looked Daniel in the eye and quietly said, "If you tear down that factory tomorrow, you'll destroy the most valuable asset this company has ever owned." They smiled with pity. None of them realized the future of a multi-billion-dollar company was still hidden inside the walls they called worthless. If you've ever watched something precious be dismissed simply because it looked old, I'd love to hear your story. Please like this video if stories about justice and hidden truth speak to your heart, and subscribe if you'd like to stay with me until the very end of mine. Before you go, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and knowing we're sharing this moment together. The next morning I returned to the old factory before sunrise. Detroit was still half asleep, wrapped in a grey October mist that softened the edges of the empty warehouses along the river. The air smelled like wet pavement, cold metal, and the faint smoke of distant traffic. I parked across the street and sat behind the wheel for several minutes, staring at the building that had once held nearly every hope I possessed. The factory looked smaller than I remembered. Its red brick walls were dark with age. Several windows had been boarded over, while others were broken and open to the weather. Rust streaked down the loading doors like dried tears. The faded company sign still hung above the entrance, although half the letters had fallen away. Holloway and Whitmore Industries. My name was still there, barely. I stepped out of the car and tightened my old coat against the cold. Near the gate, a temporary construction banner showed a polished image of what would replace the factory. Glass towers, green walkways, laboratories filled with young engineers in spotless white coats. The future of American manufacturing, the banner declared. I stood beneath it and almost laughed. The future had already been built behind those rusted walls. They simply did not know where to look. A security officer checked my visitor pass and led me inside. Daniel Whitmore had allowed me one final supervised walk through the property, not because he respected my warning, but because Margaret Sullivan had advised him that humiliating an elderly retiree in front of reporters might damage the company's public image. That was what I had become to them, a public relations inconvenience. The moment I entered the main production hall, the years fell away. The silence was overwhelming now, but in my memory the room was alive. I could hear steel being cut, engines turning, men shouting over machines, and the sharp ringing of tools against concrete. I could almost smell hot oil and welding smoke. 46 years earlier, William Whitmore and I had stood in that same hall with $27 between us. William had been 31, then tall, broad-shouldered, and full of impossible confidence. He could walk into a room with nothing but an idea and make people believe they had already seen it succeed. I was 28, quieter and more cautious. I trusted measurements more than speeches. I trusted blueprints more than promises. We were different in nearly every way, but we believed in the same thing. American factories were wasting time, energy, and materials because their production systems had been designed for a world that no longer existed. I believed there was a better method. William believed he could convince someone to pay us to prove it. The first bank turned us down. The second laughed at us. The third manager told William to find a more realistic dream, and told me that men like us did not build industrial companies without family money behind them. We left that bank in silence. Outside, William looked at me and said, "Well, John, I suppose we will have to become the family money." That was William. He could turn humiliation into fuel. We borrowed against his mother's house and sold my late father's repair shop. I still remembered signing those papers with a shaking hand. That shop was the only thing my father had ever owned. Selling it felt like tearing up the last piece of him, but I believed in the machine I had designed. And I believed in William. We rented the old factory because no one else wanted it. The roof leaked. The heating failed every winter. Half the electrical wiring had to be replaced before we could safely turn on a single machine. For the first 8 months, William and I slept in the drafting office because we could not afford apartments and payroll at the same time. He slept on a folding cot beside the door. I slept beneath the drafting table with my coat rolled under my head. During the day, William met investors, suppliers, and potential customers. At night, he returned with sandwiches and bad coffee while I worked on the first production model. People later called that model the Whitmore system. They printed his photograph in business magazines. They praised his leadership, his courage, and his vision. William never asked for that name. The newspapers gave it to him because he was the man they saw standing at podiums. I was usually behind the factory adjusting gears, measuring heat loss, or rebuilding components that had failed during testing. At first I did not mind. Fame had never interested me. I wanted the system to work. I wanted the men on the production floor to finish their shifts without injuries. I wanted small manufacturers to compete without being crushed by larger corporations. William handled the world outside. I built the world inside. That partnership made us successful. It also made me easy to erase. I walked past the remains of the original assembly line and stopped beside a thick concrete pillar. My fingers found 3 shallow marks beneath decades of grime. I had carved them there after our first profitable month. 1 mark for William, 1 for me, 1 for the company we believed would outlive us both. Mr. Holloway. The security officer's voice pulled me back. We need to keep moving. The inspection team will be here soon. I nodded and continued toward the north corridor. The executive offices had been stripped years ago, but the original engineering wing remained mostly untouched. The floor was covered in dust and pieces of fallen plaster. Old room numbers still clung to the doors. I passed the payroll office, where Evelyn Carter had once kept every receipt, contract and employee record in perfect order. Then I reached the narrow staircase leading to the drafting room. My chest tightened. That room had been my private world. Inside, the windows were clouded with dirt. Broken drafting stools lay against the wall. Water stains spread across the ceiling, and an old filing cabinet had collapsed near the doorway, but the western wall was still standing. I moved closer. The wall looked ordinary. Faded paint, cracked plaster, a rusted conduit running from floor to ceiling, yet I remembered what was behind it. After our first major patent application had been rejected over a technical filing error, I had become afraid that our work could be stolen, altered, or claimed by someone with more money than us. I began keeping original calculations and ownership documents in a protected compartment. William knew. Evelyn knew. No one else was supposed to. Years later, when the company moved its headquarters downtown, I sealed the compartment and told myself I would return for its contents after the legal department completed the transfer records. Then William became ill. The company entered a period of chaos, and I never came back. I raised my hand and touched the wall. The plaster felt cold beneath my palm. One section sounded different when I tapped it, hollow. My heart began to pound. It was still there, or at least the compartment was. I turned to the security officer. I need this room sealed immediately. He frowned. For what reason? There may be original company records inside that wall. He looked at the cracked plaster, then back at me. You will have to speak with management. Within an hour, Daniel arrived with Margaret Sullivan and 2 members of the demolition team. Daniel did not bother hiding his irritation. You told the press the building contains something valuable, he said. Now you claim there are papers inside a wall. I did not speak to the press. Someone did. You told the press the building contains something valuable, he said. Now you claim there are papers inside a wall. I did not speak to the press. Someone did. I am asking for 1 day, I said. Open the wall carefully. Let an independent archivist document everything. Daniel folded his arms. Do you understand what delaying demolition costs? Do you understand what destroying evidence could cost? His expression hardened. There is no evidence. You cannot know that until you look. He glanced toward Margaret, clearly expecting support. She studied the wall for several seconds, but before she could answer, one of the demolition contractors stepped forward. Our equipment is already scheduled, he said. Once the structural team begins tomorrow morning, this entire section comes down. I looked at Daniel. 1 day. He shook his head. No. The word echoed through the empty drafting room. I felt a familiar pain then. Not anger, something deeper. It was the pain of watching a younger man inherit the result of sacrifices he had never been taught to respect. Daniel turned toward the door. Demolition begins at 7 tomorrow morning. This discussion is over. As he walked away, I placed my palm against the hollow section of wall once more. For the first time in decades, I felt afraid. Not for myself. For what might still be hidden there. And for the possibility that someone else already knew. Daniel's refusal should have ended the matter. For several hours I tried to convince myself that it had. I drove home, placed my coat over the back of a kitchen chair, and sat alone at the table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. Outside the window, rain tapped gently against the glass. Every few minutes headlights passed across the ceiling as cars moved along the street. I could not stop seeing the western wall of the drafting room. More than 40 years earlier, I had built the hidden compartment myself. William helped me carry the steel casing upstairs after midnight because we did not want curious employees asking questions. We sealed it behind plaster, painted the wall, and covered the access point with a drafting cabinet. William had laughed while we worked. You know, Johnny said most people hide money in walls. What we are hiding may become worth more than money. At the time, neither of us knew how true those words might become. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 10 at night. The demolition crews were scheduled to arrive at 7 the next morning. Even if the compartment had survived, heavy equipment could crush everything inside before anyone realised what had been lost. I had spent most of my life following procedures, respecting contracts, and trusting institutions to act reasonably when presented with the truth. But institutions were made of people, and people sometimes valued schedules more than truth. My phone rang just as I reached for my coat. The name on the screen made me pause. Thomas Brooks. Thomas had served as the factory security supervisor for nearly 30 years. He was 71 now, and had retired before the company closed the property. He had known William and me since the days when we could barely afford one guard for the night shift. I answered. "John," he said, his voice low, "I heard what happened, then you know they begin demolition in the morning. I also know the company changed security contractors last year." I waited. Thomas had never been a man who wasted words. "The Southgate camera has been broken for 3 weeks," he continued. "The overnight patrol checks the engineering wing at 11:30, then does not return until 1. You are suggesting I trespass. I am suggesting the men who built that factory should be allowed to save its history." At 11:15, Thomas picked me up in an old blue pickup truck. Rain had become a cold drizzle and the streets around the factory were nearly empty. He wore a dark work jacket and carried a heavy flashlight, a pry bar, and a canvas tool bag. "You still keep all that equipment?" I asked. He gave me a small smile. "Some habits survive retirement." We parked behind a closed machine shop 2 blocks away and walked toward the south gate. Thomas knew where the fence had separated from one of the concrete posts. We slipped through, carefully moving between stacks of demolition barriers until we reached a side entrance. He pulled an old brass key from his pocket. "You kept that. They forgot to ask for every copy." The lock resisted, but after 2 attempts the door opened. The factory swallowed us in darkness. Our footsteps echoed across the empty production floor. Thomas kept his flashlight pointed downward so the beam would not shine through the broken windows. Each distant drip of water sounded unnaturally loud. As we crossed the main hall, I felt the building around me like the body of an old friend. I knew where the floor dipped near the former welding station. I knew which stair rail had always been loose. I remembered where men had gathered during lunch breaks and where William had once stood on a wooden crate to announce our first major contract. Now there was nothing but shadows. When we reached the north corridor, Thomas stopped. "Someone has been through here recently." He pointed toward the dust. Fresh boot prints crossed the hallway. They led directly toward the engineering wing. My heartbeat quickened. "Demolition inspectors," I whispered. "Possibly." Neither of us believed it. We climbed the narrow staircase to the drafting room. The door, which had been partly open that morning, was now closed. Thomas touched the handle, then looked at me. No lock. He pushed it open. The flashlight beam swept across the room. Several filing cabinets had been overturned. Drawers lay open across the floor. Old folders had been torn apart, their contents scattered beneath the broken windows. The drafting cabinet that once covered the hidden compartment had been dragged away from the western wall. Someone had known where to search. I crossed the room quickly and pressed my palm against the plaster. A narrow crack now ran vertically through the section I had tapped earlier. "They tried to open it," I said. Thomas examined the marks. "Not with proper tools." Looks like someone was interrupted. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Only 3 people had known about the compartment. William was dead. I was standing there, and Evelyn Carter had disappeared from company life years ago. Unless someone had discovered the secret later. Thomas handed me the pry bar. "You built it. You open it." I inserted the metal edge into the crack and pulled. The plaster resisted at first, then broke away in heavy pieces. Dust filled the air, making us cough. Beneath the wall was the steel panel, stained with rust but still intact. A small combination dial sat near the centre. I had not touched it in decades. For one terrible moment I could not remember the numbers. Then I closed my eyes. William's birthday. The month we signed our first contract. The number of the machine that completed the successful trial. The lock clicked. Thomas let out a breath. Together we pulled the steel door open. Inside were 3 narrow shelves. The first held several black engineering notebooks wrapped in oilcloth. The second contained rolled prototype sketches tied with faded string. The third shelf should have held 2 document cases and a sealed brass cylinder. One document case was gone. The remaining case had been opened and emptied. But the brass cylinder was still there. I reached inside and lifted it carefully. It was heavier than I remembered, about 2 feet long, with metal caps sealed at both ends. A strip of old red wax crossed the centre. William's initials were pressed into the seal. W. For the first time that night, hope rose inside me. "We found it," Thomas whispered. Before I could answer, a sharp electronic tone sounded from the hallway. 1 beep. Then another. Thomas turned toward the door. Motion alarm. I thought you said the patrol would not return until 1. They must have changed the schedule. Red emergency lights began flashing above us. A siren erupted through the engineering wing loud enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Thomas grabbed the notebooks while I held the cylinder against my chest. We reached the bottom of the staircase before security officers rushed into the corridor. Flashlights struck our faces. Stop where you are. Thomas raised both hands. I did not release the cylinder. 3 officers surrounded us. One recognized me immediately. Mr. Hall 1 recognized me immediately. Mr. Hall away. I need you to contact Margaret Sullivan, I said. This material must be protected. Another officer seized my arm. You are removing property from a restricted building. That property does not belong to the company. Away. I need you to contact Margaret Sullivan, I said. This material must be protected. Another officer seized my arm. You are removing property from a restricted building. That property does not belong to the company. You can explain that to management. Within 20 minutes, Daniel arrived. He entered the main hall wearing a long black coat over his dress clothes. Rebecca Hayes, the company's chief legal officer, followed close behind. Several reporters had already gathered outside the gate after hearing the security alarm. Daniel looked at the damaged wall, the scattered papers, and the cylinder in my hands. Then he looked at me with open contempt. You broke into company property. I entered the factory I helped build. You are not an owner. You should be very careful making that statement. His face tightened. He pointed toward the cylinder. What did you steal? I recovered documents that were hidden here before you were born. Daniel stepped closer. Give it to security. No. The word left my mouth calmly, but it changed the room. The officers shifted around me. Thomas moved to my side. Rebecca raised one hand. No one touches the container, she said. Not until we establish a chain of custody. Daniel turned sharply toward her. This man broke into our building, and if that cylinder contains original legal records, mishandling it could create a much larger problem. Daniel stared at her, then back at me. Outside, camera flashes flickered through the windows. He lowered his voice. You planned this. I begged you to open the wall legally. You wanted attention. I wanted the truth protected. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Daniel looked toward the reporters and made his decision. Detain them both, he told security, and call the police. As an officer took the brass cylinder from my hands, Daniel faced the cameras gathering beyond the entrance. He announced that an elderly former employee had been caught attempting to steal confidential company property from a condemned factory. I heard every word. Former employee, thief, confidential property. By sunrise, my photograph would be on television. But as they led me toward the security office, I looked back at the cylinder resting inside a clear evidence bag. I was not ashamed, because Daniel had just done the one thing I had been unable to do alone. He had forced the company to preserve it. The police did not place Thomas or me in a cell. Rebecca Hayes prevented that. She spoke privately with the officers, then explained that the ownership of the recovered materials was legally disputed and that no one could prove we intended to steal anything. The company agreed not to press immediate charges as long as the brass cylinder and the engineering notebooks remained sealed in police custody. Daniel disliked the arrangement, but the cameras outside had changed the balance of power. By morning, every local station in Detroit was repeating his accusation. Elderly, former employee caught inside condemned factory. Some reports called me a retired engineer. Others called me a disgruntled worker. One online article described me as a confused old man attempting to preserve worthless company records. None of them called me a founder. At 9 that morning, Margaret Sullivan summoned everyone to the company's downtown headquarters. The meeting took place in a private conference room on the 32nd floor far above the factory Daniel was so eager to destroy. The contrast made me uneasy. The old building had rust-leaking ceilings and cracked concrete, yet every brick carried evidence of sacrifice. The new headquarters had silent elevators, polished stone, and walls of glass. It looked impressive, but it felt disconnected from everything that had created it. Thomas sat beside me at the long conference table. Across from us were Daniel, Rebecca, Margaret, and 2 outside attorneys. A court-appointed document examiner named Michael Donovan waited near the end of the room. The brass cylinder rested inside a transparent evidence case. Daniel stared at it as though it contained an insult. Margaret opened the meeting. Because ownership of the recovered material is disputed, Mr. Donovan will inspect and document the contents. Every item will be photographed before removal. No person in this room may handle anything without authorization. Daniel leaned back in his chair. This is a waste of time. Margaret looked at him sharply. Then you should hope the cylinder is empty. Michael Donovan put on white gloves and examined the wax seal. The seal appears old and intact, he said. There are no obvious signs that either cap has been opened recently. He photographed William's initials pressed into the wax. Seeing them again brought a pressure to my chest. William had been dead for 13 years, yet his mark seemed more alive than anyone in that room. Michael carefully cut through the outer binding. He loosened the first metal cap and tilted the cylinder over a clean archival cloth. A tightly rolled bundle slid out. It was wrapped in dark blue fabric and tied with a thin leather cord. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. All this over an old bundle of paper. Michael ignored him. He untied the cord and slowly opened the fabric. Inside were 4 documents, a small black notebook, and a sealed envelope yellowed by age. The first document was an original patent application. I recognized the drawing immediately. It showed a compact thermal recovery mechanism designed to capture and redirect waste heat from heavy industrial machinery. The original system had been too advanced for practical use when I developed it. Materials available at the time could not survive repeated pressure cycles without breaking down, but the design itself had been sound. I had called it the closed-loop thermal conversion assembly. William called it the invention that would someday change everything. Michael read the title aloud. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. The company owns thousands of patents, he said. This one was never transferred to the company. I replied. Every face turned toward me. Rebecca leaned forward. What do you mean? The early patent was filed under my name before Holloway and Whitmore Industries was formally incorporated. Daniel shook his head. Anything developed for the company belongs to the company. Not if the company did not legally exist when it was developed. Michael examined the registration page. The listed inventor is John Holloway. Thomas looked at me, but I kept my eyes on the document. Rebecca asked, who is listed as the S&E? No S&E appears on the original filing, Michael said. For the first time, Daniel stopped looking bored. Michael opened the second document. It was a notarized agreement dated 3 months after the company's incorporation. William and I had signed it in the office of Judge Harold Benson, who was still a young attorney then. The agreement stated that I granted the company a limited license to test and use the thermal conversion design for research purposes. It did not transfer ownership. More importantly, the license contained a protection clause. If the company ever abandoned the original factory, attempted to destroy the prototype records, or remove my name from the invention's ownership history, the license would terminate automatically. Rebecca asked Michael to repeat that section. He did. The silence afterward felt almost physical. Daniel finally spoke. This agreement is more than 40 years old. The technology was never commercialized. That was because we could not build it safely then, I said. And now, I looked directly at him. Now the materials exist. Margaret's eyes narrowed. What materials? Heat-resistant ceramic composites. Adaptive pressure valves. Modern control systems. The limitations that prevented the design from working have been solved by industries that did not exist when I drew those plans. Rebecca turned toward one of the outside attorneys. Has the company developed anything related to thermal energy recovery? The attorney opened a laptop. Holloway and Whitmore recently acquired a startup called Novatherm Dynamics. Daniel's jaw tightened. Margaret looked at him. For how much? $280 million, he answered reluctantly. And what does Novatherm produce? Daniel said nothing. The attorney answered for him. For industrial thermal recovery systems for battery plants, data centers, and automated manufacturing facilities. A cold realization moved through the room. Rebecca requested the company's acquisition summary. After several minutes, the attorney displayed one of Novatherm's technical diagrams on the conference screen. I stood slowly. My knees hurt, but I barely noticed. The central structure was different. The control software was modern. Several components had been miniaturized, but the fundamental heat circulation path was mine. It followed the same sequence. Capture, compression, transfer, re-entry. The same 4-stage design I had drawn in the factory while William slept beside the office door. Thomas whispered. They built it. No, I said. They rebuilt it. Daniel stood. You cannot claim ownership of a modern system because one diagram looks similar. I am not claiming it because it looks similar. I pointed toward the original patent document. I am claiming it because the operating principle is identical. Michael opened the third document. It was a continuation filing prepared but never publicly recorded. Attached to it were detailed engineering notes describing every stage of the process, including the pressure sequence that appeared in Novatherm's confidential system. Rebecca stared at the papers. How could Novatherm have obtained this information? No one answered. Then Michael picked up the small black notebook. The first pages contained William's handwriting. They listed meetings, investor conversations, and early prototype failures. Near the middle was an entry written shortly before the company moved its headquarters. Michael read it aloud. John remains the sole owner of the thermal conversion invention. The company may benefit only through the limited license. This protection is necessary because future leadership may forget who built what. Daniel's face lost colour. Michael turned another page. There was a name beside a note about duplicate technical drawings. Evelyn Carter. She had prepared certified copies of my engineering records and stored one set outside the company. That meant the cylinder was not the only evidence. Margaret asked, "Do you know where Miss Carter is?" "I have not spoken to her in nearly 20 years, I said. Daniel leaned toward Rebecca. "Even if the patent is valid, it must have expired." "The original patent term has expired," Rebecca said carefully. "But that does not settle ownership of trade secrets, derivative technology, licensing rights, or possible misrepresentation during the Nova Firm acquisition." The outside attorneys began whispering. Michael reached for the final item, the sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in William's hand. John Holloway. To be opened if the factory is threatened. My throat tightened. Michael asked whether I wanted to open it. I shook my head. "You should." He broke the seal and unfolded a 2-page letter. The first lines were personal. William apologized for allowing investors to place his name above mine. He admitted that he had mistaken public recognition for harmless symbolism. Over time, that symbolism had become official history, and official history had slowly erased me. Then Michael reached the final paragraph. His voice changed as he read. "If any future officer of Holloway and Whitmore attempts to demolish the original factory, that action shall be treated as evidence that the company has abandoned its founding obligations. In that event, John's dormant ownership rights shall be restored, including controlling authority over any business derived from his thermal conversion design." Daniel struck the table with his palm. "This is not legally binding." William could not give away company control in a private letter. "No," Rebecca said quietly. But he could explain the purpose of the notarized agreement. She placed the license beside the letter. Together the documents told the same story. The factory was not merely an old building. It was a legal safeguard. Destroying it would trigger the termination clause. Margaret turned toward Daniel. "Did you complete due diligence before approving demolition?" His eyes moved between the board chair, the attorneys, and the evidence on the table. "I relied on the records provided to me." Records prepared by whom Daniel did not answer. Michael examined the empty document case recovered from the wall. "There is another problem," he said. He pointed to a clean rectangular mark inside the dusty lining. "Something was removed recently." Rebecca looked at me. "What should have been in that case?" "A complete ownership ledger," I said. It identified every license connected to the original patent. The room fell silent again. Without that ledger, proving the full financial value of my rights would be difficult, but whoever had taken it had made one mistake. They had left fingerprints in the disturbed dust. Michael sealed the empty case for forensic testing. Daniel walked toward the windows, his back to us. Below Detroit stretched toward the horizon. For years the company had treated the factory as an embarrassment from its past. Now the future of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition depended on what had been hidden inside it. Margaret ordered demolition suspended indefinitely. Then she instructed Rebecca to begin an independent investigation. As the meeting ended, I looked at William's letter beneath the conference room lights. He had known this day might come. He had known success could make people forget. But he had also left me something stronger than an apology. He had left a path back to the truth. The independent investigation began before noon. By evening, Holloway and Whitmore Industries had frozen access to its patent archives, suspended the demolition contract, and ordered every executive involved in the Nova Firm acquisition to preserve emails, handwritten notes, and financial records. Daniel remained chief executive officer, but only in name. Margaret Sullivan required him to surrender authority over the investigation and prohibited him from contacting witnesses without Rebecca Hayes present. He protested loudly enough for people outside the conference room to hear. Margaret did not change her decision. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired. The truth had finally entered the room, but truth did not erase the years spent living without recognition. It did not restore William. It did not return the employees whose names had disappeared from company history. And it did not explain who had removed the ownership ledger from the factory wall. Rebecca arranged for Thomas and me to leave through a private garage to avoid the reporters gathered outside. Before I entered the car, she handed me a temporary court order preventing the company from using, selling, or licensing any technology connected to the disputed patent. "This protects your position," she said. "It also threatens the company." "Yes." "How badly?" She hesitated. "Novatherm has contracts worth more than $4 billion. Several customers are building entire manufacturing facilities around its technology. I looked back at the tower bearing the company name William and I had chosen in a freezing workshop. So if my license terminated, those contracts may be unauthorized. That is what we must determine. The next morning, Margaret introduced me to my attorney, a patient woman named Rebecca had recommended, but who answered only to me. Together we filed a petition asking the Wayne County Court to recognize the termination clause and preserve all remaining evidence inside the factory. Daniel's attorneys responded immediately. They claimed the agreement was outdated, the patent was expired, and my ownership rights had been permanently transferred through later corporate documents. Their argument depended on a set of records dated 12 years after the original license. According to those records, I had signed a complete assignment transferring every right in the thermal conversion system to Holloway and Whitmore Industries. I had never seen the documents before. The signature looked like mine. That frightened me more than an obvious forgery would have. It copied the unusual curve in my J, the shortened line in my H, and even the small break I often left between my first and last name. My attorney placed the document on the table between us. Could you have signed this and forgotten I was 51 years old when it was supposedly executed? I was still overseeing engineering. I would remember surrendering the most important invention of my life. The assignment had been notarized by a man named Charles Mercer, who had died 6 years earlier. 2 witnesses were listed beneath my signature. One was William. The other was Evelyn Carter. William could no longer deny it. Evelyn had disappeared. The document looked designed to survive exactly this kind of dispute. Daniel used it to persuade the court that the company's operations should continue while ownership was determined. His lawyers warned that suspending Nova firm contracts would endanger thousands of jobs. They turned my claim into a threat against innocent workers. That hurt because the workers were the reason William and I had built the company. I told my attorney I would allow existing operations to continue temporarily if all revenue connected to the disputed technology entered a protected account. Daniel's lawyers called the demand extortion. Judge Harold Benson called it reasonable. I had not seen Harold in more than 20 years. Age had bent his shoulders, but his voice remained firm. Because he had helped prepare our original agreement, he could not preside over the final case. He appeared only to authenticate his signature and describe what William and I had intended. The factory was designated as a physical safeguard. He testified during an emergency hearing. Mr. Whitmore feared that future executives might destroy the early records and then claim they had never existed. Daniel sat behind his attorneys with his arms crossed. Harold continued, the clause was unusual, but it was deliberate. Mr. Holloway retained ownership because the invention existed before incorporation. One of Daniel's attorneys displayed the later assignment. Would this document have transferred those rights if genuine? Yes. The entire battle narrowed to 2 words: if genuine. A forensic examiner studied the paper ink, typewriter impressions, notary stamp, and signatures. His preliminary findings showed that the paper was consistent with the stated period. The ink was also old enough. Even the typewriter had been manufactured before the document's date. Someone had not created the forgery last week. It had been waiting for years. Rebecca's investigation then uncovered something stranger. The assignment was not in the company's legal archive before the Nova firm acquisition. It appeared in the digital system only 8 months earlier, uploaded from the private account of Chief Financial Officer Michael Donovan. The discovery shocked everyone because Michael had helped examine the cylinder. When Rebecca confronted him, he claimed the file had come from a box of records transferred from an off-site warehouse. There was no record of that warehouse, no shipping receipt, no inventory list. No employee could remember receiving the box. Margaret suspended him immediately. That afternoon, Michael asked to speak with me alone. Rebecca refused to allow a private meeting, so we gathered in a small office with my attorney and a court reporter present. Michael entered looking 10 years older than he had the day before. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his hands trembled when he placed them on the table. I did not forge the assignment, he said. Then who did? I asked. I do not know. Rebecca leaned forward. Tell the complete truth, Michael. He closed his eyes. 3 years ago, Daniel asked me to review liabilities connected to the Nova firm purchase. Our outside analyst discovered technical similarities between Nova firm's system and an early Holloway patent. My attorney asked, did you inform the board? No. Why not? Daniel said the original patent had expired and the issue was meaningless. But he continued investigating, I said. Michael nodded. He ordered a private search of the factory archives. We found references to a limited license, but not the agreement itself. Daniel became concerned that someone might challenge the acquisition. The fresh boot prints, the opened wall, the missing document case. I felt my anger rise, but I kept my voice controlled. Who searched the factory, a private records contractor, before or after demolition was approved before? Rebecca's expression hardened. So the demolition was not merely a property decision. Michael looked down. Daniel wanted the building cleared before the acquisition became public. The room seemed to become smaller. He had known. When I begged him to delay demolition, he already knew the factory might contain evidence. My humiliation had not been caused by ignorance. It had been calculated. Michael continued. Several months after the search, an envelope appeared on my desk. It contained the assignment document and a note saying it should be added to the permanent archive. Several months after the search, an envelope appeared on my desk. It contained the assignment document and a note saying it should be added to the permanent archive. Whose note? Rebecca asked. There was no signature. And you uploaded it anyway, Daniel told me to. I stared at him. You were the chief financial officer of a multi-billion-dollar company. You knew what that document could do. His eyes filled with shame. I told myself it was probably genuine. The paper was old. The signatures looked correct. I wanted to believe someone had simply found it. You wanted to protect the acquisition. Yes. And your position. He did not answer. Silence was answer enough. Rebecca asked about the ownership ledger. Michael's face changed. I never saw it. Did Daniel know it existed? He knew there was a missing record connecting the original license to later research programs. He believed it was stored in the factory. Who removed it, I do not know. He knew there was a missing record connecting the original license to later research programs. He believed it was stored in the factory. Who removed it, I do not know. My attorney placed a photograph of the empty document case in front of him. Your fingerprints were found on the outer surface. Michael stared at the image. That is impossible. They were confirmed this morning. He began breathing rapidly. I touched the case after it was recovered. During the examination, the prints were beneath the dust line, Rebecca said. They were left before the wall was opened. Michael pushed back from the table. No, I never entered that compartment. Then he stopped. His fear became something else. Recognition. There was another case, he whispered. No one spoke. He pressed both hands against his forehead. Daniel showed me a leather folder after the private search. He said it came from the engineering wing. I opened it to review the contents. What was inside, I asked. Copies of licensing records, payment schedules, research agreements. The ownership ledger, I did not know that name, but yes, it could have been. What was inside, I asked. Copies of licensing records, payment schedules, research agreements. The ownership ledger, I did not know that name, but yes, it could have been. My heart pounded. Where is it now? Michael looked toward the closed door as though Daniel might be standing outside. After I reviewed it, Daniel took it. Rebecca asked, did he say what he intended to do? Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. He said some records were too dangerous to survive. The court reporter's fingers froze above the keyboard. My attorney repeated the question. Where is the ledger? Michael began to cry. I do not know. But the night before demolition was scheduled, Daniel ordered the company jet prepared for a flight to Toronto. He carried the leather folder onto the plane himself. For the first time we had a confession connecting Daniel to the concealed records. But the strongest evidence of my ownership had crossed an international border. And if Daniel had destroyed it, the truth might still be buried beneath his lies. By the following morning, Daniel Whitmore's flight to Toronto was no longer a private company matter. Canadian authorities confirmed that the company jet had landed at Billy Bishop Airport 2 nights before the scheduled demolition. Daniel had remained in Toronto for less than 4 hours before returning to Detroit. He had declared no documents at customs. He had recorded no business meeting on his company calendar, but the jet's internal security system had captured him boarding with a worn brown leather folder beneath his arm. When Rebecca showed me the photograph, I recognized the folder immediately. William had owned it before the company could afford proper filing cabinets. He carried our earliest contracts inside it, along with payroll lists, engineering notes, and handwritten agreements with suppliers who trusted us when banks would not. I had not seen it since William's funeral. Where would Daniel take it in Toronto? I asked. Rebecca enlarged the airport records on her screen. A company car drove him to a private storage facility near the waterfront. My attorney looked at her. Who owns the facility? A holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company is controlled by Daniel's personal investment trust. The court issued an emergency preservation order. Canadian investigators searched the storage unit that afternoon. The leather folder was not there. What they found instead was a metal waste container filled with burned paper, melted plastic dividers, and fragments of old binding material. Daniel had tried to destroy the ledger. For several hours I believed he had succeeded. Then a forensic technician discovered that the storage facility's waste containers were fitted with fire suppression sensors. The moment the temperature rose, water had poured from the ceiling. The fire had damaged the documents, but it had not consumed everything. Investigators recovered more than 60 fragments. Some contained only numbers, others showed partial signatures. One small section carried 3 letters in faded black ink, HOL, my name. The final hearing began 12 days later. By then the story had spread beyond Detroit. Reporters filled the courthouse steps. Former employees stood behind metal barriers holding old company photographs and handmade signs. One sign read, "John Holloway built our future." Another read, "You cannot burn the truth." I stopped when I saw them. Many of those people had worked beside me decades earlier. Their hair had turned grey. Some used canes, others brought their children and grandchildren. For years I had believed the company had forgotten me completely. Now the people who had built it were standing outside to make certain no one forgot again. Inside the courtroom, Daniel sat behind 4 attorneys. He wore a dark navy suit and kept his expression controlled. The confident man who had humiliated me in the factory conference room was gone. In his place sat someone carefully measuring every movement. The company's lawyers argued first. They claimed Daniel had transported historical records to Toronto for secure storage. They insisted the fire had been accidental. They also maintained that the later assignment document was genuine and had legally transferred my rights. Then Rebecca called Michael Donovan. The former chief financial officer entered through a side door. He had agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration in the criminal investigation. His voice trembled when he began. He described the Nova firm acquisition, the discovery of similarities to my patent, and Daniel's private search of the factory. Daniel's attorney stood. "Mr. Donovan, you are under investigation for falsifying corporate records, correct?" "Yes." "And you hope your testimony will protect you?" "I hope telling the truth will prevent more damage." "You uploaded the disputed assignment?" "Yes." "You examined the leather folder?" "Yes." "You had access to company aircraft?" "Yes." The attorney turned toward the judge. "This witness has every reason to blame Mr. Whitmore for his own misconduct." Michael looked toward Daniel. "I did blame others for too long," he said. "That is why I am here." Rebecca then called Thomas Brooks. Thomas testified about the factory, the hidden compartment, the fresh boot prints, and the damaged wall. Security records showed that a private contractor hired by Daniel had entered the engineering wing 6 weeks before demolition approval. The contractor had remained inside for 3 hours. Its written report claimed the building contained no valuable records. Yet Daniel had paid the contractor an additional $100,000 through a private consulting account. Next came Harold Benson. He authenticated the original license and explained why William and I had tied my ownership rights to preservation of the factory records. Daniel's lawyer challenged him aggressively. "Is it not true that Mr. Holloway allowed the company to use this technology for decades without demanding payment?" "The company did not commercially use the protected invention for decades," Harold replied. "Did Mr. Holloway attend board meetings?" "Not in recent years." "Did he object when the company's public history identified William Whitmore as founder?" Harold looked toward me. Silence caused by loyalty is not the same as surrender. The courtroom became still. Then Rebecca called the forensic document examiner. He presented enlarged images of the disputed assignment. At first every feature appeared authentic. The paper was old. The ink was old. The signatures closely matched genuine examples. But beneath ultraviolet light the truth emerged. The document had been typed on paper manufactured during the correct period, yet microscopic impressions showed that an earlier text had been chemically removed from the page. Someone had taken a legitimate blank section from an old corporate document and reused it. The signatures were genuine, but they had not been written on the assignment. They had been cut from another document and transferred through a photographic reproduction process. The examiner displayed the original source. It was an employee retirement authorization signed by William Evelyn and me. My signature had been stolen from a document meant to honor a retiring factory supervisor. The assignment was a carefully constructed forgery. Daniel did not move. His lead attorney whispered to him, but Daniel kept staring at the screen. Rebecca then introduced the recovered fragments from Toronto. Technicians had reconstructed enough of the burned ledger to reveal licensing entries, payment schedules, and internal project codes. One code matched Nova Firm's earliest prototype program. Another entry showed that the company had paid a confidential research fee for access to archived Holloway engineering records. The payment had been authorized by Daniel. He had known the technology came from my work before completing the acquisition. Judge Benson was not presiding, so the final decision belonged to Judge Lorraine Matthews, a calm woman known for allowing facts to speak before she did. She looked directly at Daniel. "Did you authorize the destruction of the ownership ledger?" On advice from counsel, he refused to answer. "Did you direct Mr. Donovan to upload the forged assignment?" Again he refused. Did you approve demolition knowing the factory contained records relevant to Mr. Holloway's rights? Daniel looked down. The judge turned toward the evidence table. The court will draw the appropriate inferences. Before closing arguments, Rebecca asked permission to call one final witness. The courtroom doors opened. An elderly woman entered slowly, supported by a wooden cane. Her white hair was pulled neatly behind her head. She carried a small metal lockbox against her chest. I recognized her before anyone said her name. Evelyn Carter. For 20 years no one at the company had known where she lived. She reached the witness stand, took the oath, and looked directly at me. I am sorry it took me so long, John. My eyes filled with tears. Evelyn opened the lockbox. Inside were certified copies of the original ownership ledger, the limited license, and every engineering record William had asked her to protect. She explained that William contacted her shortly before his death. He feared Daniel's ambition and worried that future leadership might erase my contribution completely. He instructed her to keep the copies hidden unless the factory was threatened or my ownership was challenged. Why did you remain silent after demolition was announced? Rebecca asked. I did not know until I saw Mr. Holloway being called a thief on television. Evelyn turned toward Daniel. That was when I understood William's fear had come true. Her copies matched the surviving fragments from Toronto. They proved that I had never transferred ownership. They proved Novafirm's technology had been developed from my protected designs. They proved Daniel had approved the acquisition while concealing the legal risk from the board. When Evelyn finished, the judge called a recess. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded the courthouse steps. News networks were already broadcasting the reconstructed ledger and the evidence of forgery. For the first time, the world was not discussing me as a confused former employee. They were calling me what I'd always been, the original inventor, the surviving founder, and the man whose hidden patent had created the foundation for a technology now worth billions. When court resumed, Judge Matthews issued her preliminary ruling. The later assignment was fraudulent. The limited license had terminated when the company attempted to destroy the factory and erase the protected records. Until final damages were determined, all controlling rights connected to the thermal conversion technology were restored to me. Daniel closed his eyes. Margaret lowered her head. Thomas gripped my shoulder. I felt no pleasure watching Daniel's power collapse. I felt only the weight of William's final effort to correct what success had allowed us to ignore. The truth had survived the wall. It had survived the fire, and now at last it had survived us. The final ruling did not arrive with cheering. It came 3 weeks later in a courtroom so quiet that I could hear the judge turning each page. Judge Lorraine Matthews confirmed that the original license had terminated. She ruled that Holloway and Whitmore Industries had concealed material ownership risks during the Novafirm acquisition, relied on a fraudulent assignment, and attempted to destroy evidence connected to my invention. The company remained permitted to operate the technology, but only under a new license approved by me. All past revenue derived from the disputed system would be audited. A portion would be paid as damages. Another portion will be placed into a protected fund for employees, retirees, and communities affected by the company's misconduct. Daniel was removed as chief executive officer before the judge finished reading. He also faced separate criminal charges involving evidence destruction, corporate fraud, and obstruction. Reporters rushed from the courtroom. Margaret turned toward me. You control the future of the company now, she said. No, I replied. I control the invention. The company's future still belongs to the people who work there. That distinction mattered to me. During the following week, investors demanded that I sell my rights to the highest bidder. International energy companies offered sums so large that I had to read the numbers several times. One proposal exceeded $2 billion. Another included private aircraft homes in 3 countries and a guaranteed position for my family. I rejected them all. My attorney thought I was negotiating. I was not. Money had never been the reason I hid the patent. William and I had protected it because we feared what would happen if people with more ambition than judgment controlled it. The thermal recovery system could reduce energy use across factories, battery plants, hospitals, and data centers. It could also become a tool for monopolies. I agreed to license it back to Holloway and Whitmore Industries under strict conditions. The board had to create an independent ethics committee. All future patent records had to identify the true inventors. The original factory could never be demolished or sold to a private developer, and 20% of the technology's net licensing revenue had to fund workers' technical education and communities damaged by industrial decline. Margaret accepted every condition. The investors resisted the final one. They will say 20% is excessive, she warned. They said the factory was worthless, I replied. Their judgment has already been tested. Thomas laughed when I told him. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh since the night we entered the building. The employee fund became the Holloway and Whitmore Legacy Trust. I insisted that William's name remain beside mine. Some people questioned that choice after reading his letter. They saw only that he had allowed history to place him above me. But William had also spent his final years trying to repair that failure. He had created the safeguards. He had trusted Evelyn. He had preserved the path that brought the truth back. A person can fail someone and still love them. Both things can be true. The first payments from the trust did not go to executives or shareholders. They went to former factory employees whose pensions had been reduced during restructuring. Some were widows of men who had spent 30 years operating machines in rooms where winter air entered through broken windows. Others had medical bills connected to old workplace injuries. I attended the first distribution meeting at a community center in southwest Detroit. There were no television cameras inside. I had forbidden them. An 80-year-old woman named Dorothy Price approached me after the meeting. Her husband had worked in the casting department until his death. She held my hands between hers. My husband used to say you knew every worker's name, she told me. I tried to. He remembered that. She received enough money to remain in the home they had bought together. That moment meant more to me than every newspaper headline. The trust also established scholarships for students from Detroit public schools. The first group included young people who had never imagined studying engineering. I met them inside a temporary classroom built near the old factory. One student asked why I had not fought for recognition sooner. The honest answer embarrassed me. I thought humility meant remaining silent. Was that wrong? She asked. Sometimes humility becomes permission for other people to rewrite your life. She wrote that sentence in her notebook. I hoped she would remember it before making the same mistake. The company began restoring the factory in early spring. Engineers examined the foundation and discovered that the structure was stronger than expected. The main production floor could be preserved. The drafting room could be rebuilt around the hidden compartment. Margaret proposed turning the building into a corporate museum. I rejected the word corporate. Corporations like to tell clean stories. They displayed success in glass cases and hid the cost in locked archives. I wanted the factory to tell the complete story. The museum would show William and me sleeping beside the machinery because we could not afford heat at home and in the factory. It would show the first rejected bank applications. It would list the names of workers who accepted late pay during our hardest year. It would explain how my contribution disappeared from public history. It would also document Daniel's misconduct. Margaret hesitated at that condition. You want the company to display its own scandal. I want future leaders to understand what happens when institutions protect their image more than the truth. She agreed. We named it the Founders and Workers Museum. Not the Holloway Museum, not the Whitmore Museum. Workers had built the company with us. Their history belonged on the walls too. One afternoon I returned to the drafting room while restoration crews repaired the windows. Sunlight crossed the dusty floor where Thomas and I had opened the wall. The steel compartment remained exposed. Inside it, conservators had placed replicas of the notebooks and patent documents. The originals were secured in an archival facility. I stood there alone until I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel entered with a court-appointed officer. He had asked to see me before his sentencing hearing. He looked smaller, without the authority of his title. His suit was simple, and exhaustion had carved deep lines beneath his eyes. I do not expect forgiveness, he said. That is good. His face tightened. I thought you would enjoy this. What, watching me lose everything? I looked around the room. You still believe this was about winning? You took the company from me. No, your choices took it from you. He turned toward the compartment. My father never believed I was good enough to lead. William believed you confused control with leadership. Daniel looked at me sharply. He talked to you about me. Many times. What did he say? That you were intelligent, that you worked harder than people realized, that you were terrified of being ordinary. Daniel lowered his eyes. I continued. He worried that fear would make you destroy anything you could not claim as your own. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Daniel asked the question I had not expected. Did he love me? The anger left his voice. What remained was the frightened son beneath the executive. Yes, I said. But love does not always teach people how to become better fathers. His eyes filled with tears. I spent my whole life trying to prove I deserved his name, and you nearly destroyed what the name represented. He nodded slowly. I know, I did not forgive him that day. Forgiveness offered too quickly can become another form of dishonesty, but I told him the museum would include William's failures as well as his achievements. It would show that legacy was not perfection. Legacy was the truth we left behind, and the effort we made to repair what we had damaged. Daniel looked through the broken window toward the factory yard. When I get out, could I see it? If you come as William's son, I said, not as the man who believes he owns it. He accepted that. Before leaving, he paused at the door. I am sorry I called you a thief. I looked at the hidden compartment. You were not the first person to steal my history. Then I looked back at him. But you can be the last. After he left, I remained in the drafting room until sunset. Below me, workers repaired the same building other workers had once been ordered to destroy. The factory had been saved. The company had been changed. The invention would create billions, but this time its success would not belong only to executives behind glass walls. It would support widows, retirees, students, workers, and families who had sacrificed without seeing their sharp names on a patent. That was the settlement I wanted. Not revenge, restoration, not control, responsibility. And as the evening light passed across William's initials on the replica seal, I finally understood why the old factory had survived for so long. It had never been waiting to make me rich, it had been waiting to remind us who the future was supposed to serve. 1 year after the court ruling, I stood outside the old factory, beneath a sky that looked almost exactly as it had on the morning Daniel ordered it destroyed. The difference was in the building. Its original red bricks had been cleaned but not replaced. We kept the stains around the loading doors and preserved the faded outlines where old company signs had once hung. The broken windows were repaired with glass, designed to match the original paint. Nothing looked artificially perfect. That had been my condition. The factory had survived years of work neglect, ambition, and betrayal. I did not want restoration to erase its scars. Hundreds of people gathered near the entrance for the official opening of the Founders and Workers Museum. Former employees arrived with families. Engineering students stood beside retired machine operators. Local teachers brought children who had only known the property as an abandoned industrial building behind a rusted fence. Now sunlight reflected from the restored letters above the main doors. Holloway and Whitmore Industries, original factory. Below those words a new bronze plaque had been installed. It did not call me a visionary. It did not call William a legend. It read, built by 2 founders and thousands of workers who believed that industry should serve people. Thomas stood beside me wearing the same dark suit he had worn to court. Evelyn sat in the front row beneath a white canopy wrapped in a blue coat. Despite the warm weather, Margaret approached with a folder. The board is ready, she said. I looked toward the stage. Are the workers ready? She smiled. They had been ready longer than the board. The company had declared the opening date Founder Recognition Day. I had objected to the name at first because it sounded like another ceremony, created to polish the company's reputation. Margaret convinced me only after agreeing that the event would recognise every inventor, technician, machinist, secretary, cleaner, security officer, and factory worker whose contribution had been overlooked. The first names read aloud were not mine or William's. They belonged to 12 workers who had remained through our earliest financial crisis. One had repaired machines without pay, another had brought food for employees whose checks were delayed. A young secretary had typed investor letters late into the night while caring for 2 children alone. Their families received framed copies of the original payroll ledger. Some cried when they saw the names. For decades, those families had possessed only stories. Now the stories had become part of the official record. When Margaret invited me to the microphone, applause moved through the courtyard. I waited until it faded. People keep telling me this factory has been restored, I began. But buildings are easier to restore than trust. The crowd grew quiet. Trust cannot be repaired with new windows or polished floors. It returns only when institutions admit what they did preserve the evidence, and change who benefits from their success. I looked toward the young students gathered near the front. When I was younger, I believed that good work would speak for itself. I believed loyalty required silence. I thought asking for recognition would make me selfish. I paused. I was wrong. Thomas lowered his head. Evelyn watched me with tears in her eyes. Your work may speak, but powerful people often decide whether anyone is allowed to hear it. Protect your ideas, keep records, tell the truth about what you contribute. Humility should guide your character, but it should never erase your name. The applause that followed was not loud at first. It began with the workers. Then it spread through the entire courtyard. After the ceremony, the museum doors opened. The first exhibit recreated the workshop where William and I had built our earliest machines. Visitors could see the cracked drafting table, the old coffee pot, and the heater that worked only when someone struck its side. The second exhibit showed the growth of the company, but it did not hide the failures. It included rejected designs, financial losses, labor disputes, and the years when executives slowly removed my contribution from official history. The final gallery displayed the thermal conversion patent. A replica rested inside a glass case. Beside it was a simple explanation of how the invention had become the foundation for modern systems now used around the world. A digital screen displayed the total revenue produced by the technology. The number had passed $6 billion. Another screen showed where the Legacy Trust had distributed its share. Retiree medical support, worker pensions, engineering scholarships, community energy projects, factory safety programs. The invention had made the company richer, but for the first time its value was flowing back toward the people who had helped create the conditions for it to exist. Near the end of the tour, I entered the restored drafting room. The hidden compartment remained open behind protective glass. Inside were copies of William's letter, the license agreement, and Evelyn's certified records. I was reading the plaque when someone spoke behind me. It looked smaller than I remember. I turned. Daniel stood near the doorway. He had served 10 months in a federal correctional facility after accepting responsibility for evidence destruction and obstruction. His sentence had been reduced because he cooperated with investigators and helped recover additional financial records. He was thinner now. His expensive confidence had disappeared. Margaret had not invited him as a company representative. I had invited him as William's son. For a moment neither of us knew what to say. Then Daniel walked toward the drafting table. My father brought me here once, he said. I was 9. I remember. You asked 9. I remember. You do. You asked why every machine was so loud. A faint smile crossed his face. He told me noise meant people were building something. That sounded like William. Daniel looked at the copy of his father's letter. I hated him after the trial. Why every machine was so loud. A faint smile crossed his face. He told me noise meant people were building something. That sounded like William. Daniel looked at the copy of his father's letter. I hated him after the trial. Because he protected me, because he understood what I might become. I did not answer. He continued. In prison, I kept thinking about the day you came to the demolition meeting. You were standing there, asking for one delay. I already knew the records might exist. His voice weakened. I could have stopped everything. Yes. I wanted the factory gone because it proved the company existed before me. Every time I saw it, I felt like I was living inside someone else's achievement. I looked at him carefully. That feeling did not make you dangerous. What you chose to do with it did. He nodded. I know. We stood before William's letter. Daniel asked, "Do you forgive me?" I had imagined that question many times. In those imagined moments, I always had a perfect answer. The real answer was more complicated. I no longer want your life destroyed, I said, but forgiveness does not remove consequences. It does not return the records you burned or undo the people you deceived. I understand. What it can do is prevent your worst decision from becoming your entire identity. His eyes filled with tears. Is that possible? It depends on what you build next. Daniel looked at the man. What you build next. Daniel looked through the drafting room window. Outside, children were examining one of the restored machines, while a retired worker explained how it operated. My father would have loved this, he said. He would have argued about half of it. Daniel laughed through his tears. So would you. We did. I offered him my hand. He stared at it before taking it. It was not a public reconciliation. No cameras were present. There was no dramatic announcement and no promise that our relationship would suddenly become easy. It was simply 2 men standing inside a room where pride had nearly destroyed everything. Before he left, Daniel placed a small envelope on the drafting table. Inside was his resignation from every remaining family trust and a written pledge, transferring his future inheritance into the Worker Scholarship Fund. You do not have to do this, I told him. I know. Then why? Because for the first time I want the name Whitmore to give something back. After the museum closed that evening, I walked alone through the factory. The restored lights glowed above the production floor. Old machines stood beside modern educational displays. Every room carried both the past and the future. I stopped near the place where William and I had once made our first successful prototype. For years I thought justice meant receiving credit for what had been taken from me. I had been partly right. Names matter, truth matters, recognition matters. But justice became complete only when the invention began serving people beyond me. The old factory had been called worthless because its value could not be measured from the outside. People are often treated the same way. Age can hide experience. Silence can hide sacrifice. A modest life can hide extraordinary work, but something does not become worthless simply because others fail to recognize it. Sometimes the greatest value remains hidden until the right moment, waiting behind an old wall, inside a forgotten letter, or within a person everyone has stopped seeing. As I turned off the final light, I touched the brick beside the drafting room door. The building had protected my invention. In the end, the invention had protected the building, and together they had reminded an entire company that the future means nothing if it forgets the people who built the past. What this story reminds us, perhaps more than anything, is that value is not determined by what the world sees, but by what we quietly build over time. Too often, people are dismissed because they are older, quieter, or no longer standing in the spotlight. But behind many of those invisible lives are years of sacrifice, wisdom, and contributions that shaped everything we now take for granted. John Holloway's journey teaches us that silence can be mistaken for weakness, and humility can be exploited by those who are louder but not wiser. There is nothing wrong with being humble, but we must never allow humility to erase our truth. Your work matters, your voice matters, and your story deserves to be told, especially in rooms where others benefit from your absence. It also reminds us that success without integrity is fragile. Daniel had power, wealth, and control, but he built it on fear and insecurity, and in the end it collapsed under the weight of truth. Real legacy is not about owning something, it is about protecting it, honouring it, and making sure it continues to serve others long after you are gone. And maybe the most powerful lesson is this: it is never too late for the truth to come back. It may be hidden, ignored, or even buried, but if it was built on something real, it will find its way into the light. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, remember this story. You may be standing in your old factory right now, something others think has no value, but that doesn't mean it isn't holding something extraordinary. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated or had your contributions ignored? How did it make you feel and what did you learn from it? Leave a comment below and share your story. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are many more powerful emotional stories like this waiting for you, and I'd love to have you here for the next one.